Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week, we feature interviews with incredible poets and artists, including Olivia Gatwood and A.E. Stallings, and original poetry read by the authors. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas and Portraits of Red and Gray. Sean Singer is the author of Discography, Yale University Press 2002, winner of the Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize, selected by W.S. Merwin and the Norman Farber First Book Award from the Poetry Society of America, Honey and Smoke, iWare Publishing 2015, and, most recently, Today in the Taxi, Tupelo Press 2022. He runs a manuscript consultation service at SeanSingerPoetry.com. Sean, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Really excited to have you here. So before I ask about your upcoming book, I have to share, I loved every page. I found myself getting into flow as I was reading and almost finished your book in one sitting. How did you approach ordering the poems, and were you consciously trying to sustain the momentum of the book?
The ordering of the poems is not very straightforward. I think, they're not chronological, and they're not, they're a little bit create the sensation of something that's fragmented, but has repeated elements or constants, such as the phrase "today in the taxi," the form, and then the various kind of characters that reappear. So I think they sort of start off almost more narrative and become more lyrical as it continues to the end, where it's almost like less physically connected to the street or the car, where it's a little more porous and a little more not, I guess, abstract, and then each section has the same number of poems, so it creates a kind of balance.
Yeah, well, that's of course, those are the things that are done behind the scenes that I'm not conscious of, but I could feel that there was just an energy that kept it moving forward. So to make, you brought this up in your answer there, but let's dive a little deeper. To make the book more than a series of anecdotes from your years as a taxi driver, you include the voices and characters of Kafka, jazz musician Charles Mingus, and the Lord as a female voice. You describe them as an ethical GPS for the reader. How did you choose these voices to complement and help expand your experiences?
They're kind of like a bridge between the immediacy of the experience and the sort of internal state or the inward state of the driver. That they're kind of reference points or portals to more parables or philosophies, or they're sort of like external things that the driver can then bounce off of as he's reacting to the situations, because driving is full of dualities and contradictions. Like, you're sitting but you're moving forward, you're invisible but you're overhearing like very intimate details of people's lives. You're looking forward but sort of responding backward, all these kinds of things. And so those voices or those characters sort of allow connections among all those different states of being.
Oh, I love that the duality you just went through and showed multiple examples of. That's beautiful, and it matches the form. So as you mentioned, each poem follows a common structure: a vignette introduced with "Today in the Taxi," presented succinctly, matter of fact, pretty much, and then a turn. Did this approach come later, requiring you to rework earlier poems to fit the structure, or did the structure of the poems emerge early?
Uh, well, I had been taking notes on just different experiences I had, and I didn't find the form. I didn't know what the form was going to be. And for me, the form is almost the entire goal or the entire point. The content is sort of less important for me. And once I decided to make them into prose poems, which is a contradiction in and of itself, um, then all of these scenarios I had been thinking about sort of came out all at once. And then, of course, I revised some, I deleted some, um, and made changes to some of the, literary fixes, I call them. And also, the prose poem has a long history of being connected to cities and talking about cities, going back to Charles Baudelaire. Um, so it was a great way to balance the narrative aspects, the more lyrical aspects, and the physical embodied moments with the sort of thinking through of the self in relation to those physical things. And I actually I physically did all the things that I talk about, lifting the bags and cleaning up the messes and all these. I mean, I actually experienced and lived in my body all of those different things. So they they in a sense are, the form is very important to contain that and to let the poems exist in an external form that readers can then find a way into.
So, you're making me think of a prose poem that I wrote this in my upcoming book, and I took several runs at it, and it just wasn't working with other forms. It was I had something that was very structured and metered and a rhyming pattern, and it just was working against the material. And I threw it out and restarted and did this prose poem approach. Was that similar? Were there other forms that you tried for the first couple and it just wasn't working?
Um, Not really. I had to think through what the right form would be.
Hmm.
Um, I I tend to think about a poem for a really long time, months or even years, um, and until I can figure out what the right form is, I can't. I don't actually literally write anything. But then when I sit down to write, it all kind of comes out.
That's that's fascinating because I'm completely the opposite. I've gotten into a habit now of, because I'm a night owl, and so I don't drive my wife nuts. I'm on my phone on Google Docs in dark mode, just writing. And Google Docs, it's impossible to do any kind of form on a phone. It's too hard. So I just write words and phrases and images, and then I have this raw material, and then I start figuring out. That's really fascinating to hear the different approaches poets take. Yeah. So, many books of poetry are collections of poems written individually without a book in mind. At what point did you know you had a book in the making versus maybe a long poem or a long series of poems? And how did that influence your approach to selecting which stories to tell and which to edit out?
Um, I happen to think that poems are exist sort of like in the atmosphere,
Hmm.
in the environment, and just it's the responsibility of the poet to have enough facility with language to sort of be attuned to when those poems occur, when those moments occur, and then sort of transmit or transcribe them into English from this, like a wider poetry language that it just exists in some kind of ether. Um, and driving the taxi for many hours allow it's like 90% boredom and 10% sheer terror. So a lot of the times it's very mundane and repetitive, and you just have a lot of time to think and sort of brood. um, and when I realized that I could enough just very strange things happen. Just it was like this window into people's lives, like this rolling therapist office or rolling confessional, um, that I thought it might become a book. And then, some of them, like, so I had some strange experiences that just I couldn't make them into. I couldn't convey the immediacy of it, or they were too difficult to explain, um, or were just less. I was just less interested in them after a while. Um, yeah,
The stories you share capture the amusements, peculiarities, and annoyances of everyday life, yet each expands into something philosophical or profound. How did you find those connections, are really surprising? And what I think makes this book so compelling to read is it's almost like each poem is this little Easter egg that starts very matter of fact, mostly, and then has this profound twist. And I'm thinking as I'm reading, how did he connect these dots? Like, this is just amazing, and how much time
thank
that
you.
took to do that. So,
Yeah, well, prose is, for the most part, um, about taking things apart, which is analysis, whereas poetry is about bringing things together, which is metaphor. And poems are metaphoric, but they're also metabolic, meaning your breath is involved, your hand is involved. Um, and they're metamorphic, meaning like the speaker changes or transforms in some way, um, through the act of making the poem. And the metaphors which sort of bridge these idiosyncratic or strange or upsetting or whatever moments, um, they do have, um, mirrors or reflections in other aspects of experience. So, for example, this poem where the woman leaves her baby in the car and then goes into the building
mhm.
for, and I didn't know if she was going to come back or what. And then I had read, in one of Franz Kafka's diaries that, he had read this story about a woman who killed her 9-month old, and it just the aspect of danger and different ideas of how to, just the mindset you'd have to leave a baby with a
Mhm.
stranger, a strange man in a place like New York City. Like it just, and yet on another level, it's not terrifying. It's like completely mundane. Like she was fine with it. I had to be fine with it.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know how I found the relationships, but I guess I just think about these things almost constantly, and
Yeah.
then they sort of meld together somehow.
Yeah. So as I was reading the poems, I thought of certain movies and spread throughout the book. Sure enough, there they were: Night on Earth, Taxi Driver, Drive, Patterson. It made me think of how drivers are in a unique position to invisibly observe. In the poem Invisible Screen, you write, "The inside of the cab, neither public nor private, is so transparent that you can look through it and see the world." I thought of Adorno talking about Beethoven's long waves of bass notes, not of tension, but of lingering. How has writing this book and your experiences as a driver influenced your poetry overall?
Um, that's interesting. Well, I think it's very difficult to balance conveying lived experience with surprising or electric language. Some people
Mhm.
can do one or the other, but then when you try to do both, it's almost like moving a seesaw. Like on one end, you've got communication or straight sense, and on the other side, music or just um, the internal thinking, which is not always sensible or makes sense. Um, and poems usually can't do both. Um, so, I think the prose poem, because allows, it kind of enhances juxtapositions or contradictions. Um, it it was a way for me to have nonfiction type of types of observations with lyric, uh, or more passionate syntax. And for a long time, I really couldn't write anything. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I can't make anything up. So I really need
Mhm.
something as the source. Um, and I'm also interested in the process of creativity. Um, and so I think, well, the other part is this book is much more vulnerable and straightforward and direct than I've done in the past.
Mhm.
For example, I never wrote in the first person before. Um, and being vulnerable in that way is very risky. Um, so I think that was the main way that it changed my thinking about how to approach a poem.
Yeah, beautiful. So your poem, "The Entire City," stood out for its break from the structure you'd set. You wrote, Today in the taxi, the yellow moon was a coin, and the kale florets moved serrated edges along an orange grid. A citadel on a hill spiral. No one breathed a note, and a ruin rubbed a fish backbone over a texture. Even though this poem is formatted as a paragraph you could have used enjambment, it's arguably not a prose poem at all. Was a break from the pattern at about the midpoint of your book intentional to kind of shake things up and make things a little
Hmm.
less predictable? Or was that just an unconscious thing?
I can't remember my thinking of why I placed that one exactly where it is, but yeah, the manuscript as a whole, there's sort of an arc um, that becomes more lyrical in some ways, and where the Lord's voice kind of rises up a little bit. Um, and also, I wanted to have enough variation within that form and um, still be connected to what came before and after. And so this device of having every poem begin with "Today in the taxi," it's almost like this endless loop
Mhm.
where you don't know if it's the same day or a different day or whatever, which is kind of what it feels like. Um, and I think after all those years, I drove on every single street, and also I was somehow able to remember most of the trips, like where I got them, where they were going, who they were. Um, but the book, I don't describe what anyone looks like.
Right, right.
I don't. I wanted to present them almost as these ciphers where they're just people that have experiences that you don't know who they are necessarily, which is kind of what it's like.
Yeah,
Um,
you kinda they dip in, you don't dip in, they dip in for a little slice, and then they dip out, and
yeah,
you likely never see them again. Yeah.
yeah.
So, in addition to the 3 books you've written, you also author a newsletter, The Sharpener, which is terrific. I recommend people check it out, and offer editorial services. Share a bit more about the services you offer for aspiring authors and poets.
Um, I sometimes describe it as psychological revision or psychological coaching through writing, because so much of the risk in writing poetry is really um, being open to a part of the self that's not readily expressible or explainable, and then to be able to present it in a way that has enough air, whether it's a door or window for an outside reader who is separated in time and space, to find a way into it, to say, oh, that sounds like this person understood what it was like. Um, but that process, that long middle psychological stage between the initial impulse or the initial uh, triggering subject, Hugo called it, and the thing that's as close to your intention or the poem in the mind, like that middle space is not understood. So I don't impose my own aesthetics. I try to help the person uh, go through that um, the weeds of all that and the wilderness, and try to best convey what they intended it to say. And sometimes those things are literary, like verb tenses, say, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are actually about looking inward, or looking into the psychodynamics of the thing that's being written. I mean, it's not talk therapy, but it's using um, the the skills of that to best bring the poem out and onto the page.
Well, that's a perfect.
I also help
Yeah.
people with different lengths of projects. Like, it could be just one poem, or it could be a whole manuscript, or yeah, whatever.
Cool. Well, that's a perfect bridge to turning the mic over to you. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you to read a couple of selections from your book.
Anti-venom. Today in the taxi, I got a fare from Park Chester to the Bronx Zoo. She finally came out of the building, put her baby in the car seat, and said, "I forgot something upstairs." Then she left the baby in the car and went back inside for about 7 or 8 minutes. I couldn't believe it. I'm a safe person to leave a baby with, but she didn't know that. I was nervous. Some people live without contradiction. I remained calm, even though the situation was beyond the job description. Don Byas had a serpent's tooth affixed to the octave key of his tenor saxophone. Perhaps it helped him push into the wilderness, or to ward off evil. One sunny July, Kafka says he wept over the report of the trial of Marie Abraham, who, because of poverty and hunger, strangled her 9-month-old with a man's tie she used as a garter. Days of Winter. Today in the taxi, I brought a Chinese couple, parents of a student at Columbia, from Amsterdam Avenue to JFK. The girl was crying, the mother was crying. The parents sat in silence for most of the trip. They didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Chinese. I did offer them a little package of tissues. On the other hand, the sun came out, and it warmed to 24 degrees. A driver should find a fixed object on the road, such as a sign or a tree, and when the car in front passes it, count 3 seconds before his own car passes it. Then add a second for each hazard, rain or darkness. The road is not unlike a little pressed between vessel that the car pushes along its black bloodstream. A psalm instructs that it will be as it is said.
Love both those selections. So you started talking about this earlier about how in this the anti venom you started to see these connections because you're thinking about them all the time. Is there also a process of editing out connections where, okay, I got 3 or 4 to choose from and choosing the one that is the best? Because again, I think I can see it now. You're just immersed in this book and you've got a pattern going. So you're starting, like you said, the poems are sitting there in the natural environment waiting to be written down, just like the sculptor sees a block that, the figure is inside the block of stone. The sculptor's job is just to get rid of the stone that shouldn't be there. So yeah, kind of we're using that specific poem, the editorial process you went through.
Um, well, I think that's a good question. Well, I think the situation. I knew that I wanted to write about it, and then I knew, sort of apart from this situation, that I wanted to somehow include this saxophone specialist, Don Bias, who had a serpent's tooth attached to his saxophone. And this idea of sort of predation, danger, um, trust, and sort of suspense was sort of embodied in that image. And so that becomes sort of the bridge between, the actual scenario and then this thing that happened 100 years ago, with where it says, where you can picture Kafka and reading this thing in the newspaper. And so it creates kind of a fluidity where these different moments, or these different ways of being, kind of can coalesce. So it's a little like a collage in some ways, where I have these different images that I then have to figure out how they're going to fit together.
Yeah. So did you ever need to nudge the truth a bit in the opening vignettes of each poem, or did the truth of your years as a taxi driver provide more than enough raw material than you could ever fit in a book?
No, not everything in there is 100% exactly how it happened.
That's terrific. Yeah, I did have
any of it.
I asked that because I'm working on a poem this week where I love taking photos of street art, and I was in Montreal, and there were last year, and there was just beautiful street art everywhere. But I also had this amazing photo of light going through a pool toy in Phoenix at my older daughter's house, reflected on a wall, and it just perfectly fit the poem. So I'm like, okay, that's now street art in Montreal, and I'll just nudge the truth a little bit. But that's cool that you didn't have to do that. In Days of Winter, and so many of your poems in this collection, I wonder, are there moments when, as a driver, you wanted a bit more time with your passengers rather than being briefly inserted into their lives, or them inserted into your life and then whisked away to the next fare?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, once in a while, there was somebody really interesting, or that I felt, I could probably get to know this person in reality. But I'm very, in some ways, closed off. I have a lot of social anxiety, so the anonymity is somehow a comfort. So I was always, most of the time, I was happy that it was just brief. And also, I'm focused on the actual task of driving safely, when there's so many dangerous things happening constantly.
Yeah. Well, Sean, I want to thank you so much for, first of all, having an opportunity to read your book. Wonderful book, and sharing your poetry on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Twitter at Dublin Ranch, subscribe to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and follow us on viewlesswings.com or on Instagram at Viewless Wings.